This is a story of two pastors. Both love the Lord. Both have sensed a call from God to serve the local church. Both have answered affirmatively to that call, and they give themselves daily to it. One pastor goes to work at 8 a.m., the other one between 5 and 6 a.m. The first pastor arrives at his church office. The second pastor arrives at a construction site. One pastor's day is filled by reviewing financial reports, preparing sermon notes, making hospital visits, having staff meetings. The other pastor's day is filled pouring and finishing concrete slabs and foundations. One pastor has an office filled with books from his seminary days. He has a church-provided computer and resources that were purchased with the pastor's allowance in his church's budget. The other pastor's office is maybe visited once or twice a week. The pastor uses his own computer if he has one, but most likely he's using his phone to fulfill his pastoral duties throughout the week. There aren't many books in his office because he simply hasn't gone to seminary. One pastor felt a calling to pastoral ministry when he was at youth camp. He went to a denominational college and on to get his master's of divinity. That pastor served as a church intern in college and in seminary. He was hired as a youth pastor, served as an associate, and then was called as the lead pastor of his current church. The other pastor was a deacon at his church. The pastor there left. The church, in evaluating its finances, discovered they couldn't afford a full-time pastor. The deacon was asked to supply the pulpit and provide some leadership in the interim time. And that interim stretched from 6 months to a year to 2 years. And the church finally decided, let's just ordain him and call him as a pastor. And the call of God came late in life for this pastor. He has a family to raise. He's self-employed. He just can't get up and go to the nearest seminary. One pastor works 40 to 50 hours a week to serve his congregation and his community. The other works 40 to 50 hours a week, and only then, after that, can he begin to work serving his congregation and his community. And that's only the beginning of the differences in the dynamics of the role of the bivocational pastor compared to his full-time counterpart. So even more challenging is that this particular bivocational pastor belongs to a subset of bivocational pastors. And that subset ministers to first-generation non-English speaking congregations. So in my context of ministry, that pastor is preaching and ministering to his congregation in Spanish, but it could be Korean, Chinese, or Burmese. So he not only has a congregation that he was called to serve, like other pastors and bivocational pastors, but he also has this second emerging congregation within his current congregation. It is a young, second-generation, English-speaking, acculturated generation. So as if bivocational ministry just isn't hard enough to do as it is, the demands and challenges of these particular bivocational pastors have just doubled. So in order to serve the emerging congregation effectively, they must do so in the new heart language of that congregation, which is English, and it's not the pastor's first language. To serve that emerging congregation effectively, the pastor has to do that in the context of this fused culture of second-generation immigrants. So now this bivocational pastor, apart from pastoring his regular congregation, he's also a missionary to the children and the grandchildren of those first-generation congregants. So now we have a bivocational pastor that must engage. He's got to preach to and disciple and retain and train and incorporate this second-generation congregation alongside the first. Ministering to these two congregations, often in the same service, in different languages, to two different cultures, all while serving bivocationally. So when we think about the dynamic role of bivocational pastors, and by dynamic, we mean that it's characterized by constant change and constant activity, there's absolutely no doubt that the role of a bivocational pastor is one of the most dynamic roles serving our church today.
Well, great. I'm Daryl Stevens. I teach at Lancaster Theological Seminary, and I have a new book out called Bivocational and Beyond, which I will tell you more about, but also put in the chat a link to that book. It is open access, and you can download it for free. I'm going to share my screen and present some research.
Daryl, I also I went too early because some people are, oh, everybody's coming back now. So right on time.
Okay, so I'm Daryl Stevens. I'm presenting research on bivocational ministry as a congregational calling. There are significant challenges to understanding and practicing bivocational ministry. Several of those challenges are defining bivocational or multivocational ministry, negative perceptions of bivocational ministry, and the full-time bias. The third challenge is our cultural and demographic context, framing and motivating bivocational ministry. And the fourth challenge that I'm going to talk about today is shifting to a missional perspective on congregational calling and ministry. I'm going to go through each one of these challenges. Definitions and terms. Bivocational ministry is generally defined as a combination of employment, paid or unpaid, within and beyond the local congregation by someone called to pastoral ministry. It is contrasted with fully funded ministry, as well as part-time ministry not accompanied by other significant employment or volunteer work. So that's an initial definition for us. There are many different terms that describe how people in pastoral leadership engage in what I'm calling bivocational ministry. So here are just a few of the terms that you may have heard. Tent making, marketplace ministry, entrepreneurial ministry, co-vocational, part-time or self-supporting, multivocational, bivocational, dual career. Each of these terms encompasses the unique callings of individuals within specific contexts and church polities. Bivocational ministry is a unique fit for each pastor. Successful and healthy multivocational ministry requires vocational integration, congregational receptivity, intentionality in employment, discerning a unique fit, and being psychologically prepared. And I'm drawing on the Canadian Multivocational Ministry Project for some of these. Bivocational ministry thrives with whole life integration of vocation, employment, ministry, family, and other aspects of our multiplicity. Thus, it's difficult to describe or to create one definition to cover every variation. The second challenge is negative perceptions. Negative perceptions of bivocational ministry. We've talked about this in our first breakout group. Bivocational ministry is often perceived as second class or less than or unqualified or ineffective. Sometimes the kinds of things we hear are, well, if that person were a real minister, they'd be full-time. Or if only, perhaps they are part-time because they're not as effective as other ministers. Or perhaps it's due to a lack of opportunity or decline. So there are a lot of negative perceptions associated with this. And all of these negative perceptions reflect a full-time bias preventing us from understanding bivocational ministry as an intentional missional endeavor. There's much to be learned from intentional bivocationality as a missional, vocational, and faithful way of responding to God's call to all the baptized. It is a way of offering one's whole self in service to church and world. And I'll look at this full-time bias a little bit. The standard model in North America is a fully compensated, professionalized pastoral ministry. That's what many have gotten used to, and it reflects the ideas and assumptions of Christendom. That is that the default religion within our society is Christian, and that we can assume that most people are Christian in society. That's the idea of Christendom. This reflects, it also, full-time bias also reflects a culture of bigger is better or worth measured by money. That is, we tend to value more what we pay for or what is compensated. Full-time pastorates then become the norm against which all others are compared, even in traditions in which part-time ministry is common. Like Jesse mentioned, immigrant community churches often have bivocational ministers, yet within our culture, they are then compared to the full-time norm. The reality of bivocational ministry, here are a few statistics, though it is difficult to get accurate statistics because of the definitional problem I began with. There's so many different names for it and so many different ways that people engage in bivocational ministry. It's hard to get accurate measures. 35% of US congregations are served by a head clergy person who also holds another job. That's a national congregation survey. 42% of Southern Baptists are bivocational. 46% of Episcopal congregations have no full-time priest. 30% of seminary graduates plan to serve in bivocational ministry. And I will add, a lot more than that will end up in bivocational ministry, whether they plan on it or not. Some researchers observed no increase in bivocational ministry in the last 25 years. The statistics varied by gender, marital status, and geographic region. Particular study I'm referring to indicated that married white men in the southern US were more often full-time pastors than their counterparts. Culture and demographics has a lot to do with how we understand and what motivates bivocational ministry. Part of this is adaptation to change. Fully funded ministry is the norm within white majority mainline denominations, or at least it has been. Discrepancies between the way things used to be and the way things are require us to adapt. Bivocational ministry is the norm in many other contexts. However, changing demographics require that ministry be done differently today than in previous generations. All churches are encountering a religious landscape much different than even 10 years ago. Simply put, the old North American white Christendom is over. And I will explain what I mean by that. Here's a study of 20 years of congregational change showing that the trend of declining membership and attendance among all denominations in the US began well before the disruption of COVID-19. The statistics for 2020 are pre-COVID on this graph. And you can see that the median worship attendance among US congregations was 65 persons in 2020, which was less than half what it was in 2000. The steady and precipitous decline in participation impacts not only finances, but also the everyday practices of ministry. Another way to look at this is the increasing number of small congregations in the US. Small congregations have become more common during the last 20 years. Before the pandemic, nearly 2/3 of US congregations had weekly worship attendance of less than 100 people. Thus, fewer churches can afford full-time seminary-trained pastors than in generations past. However, a closer look at membership decline by race and ethnicity shows a more complicated picture, prompting the question, is membership decline a white problem? Over the last few decades, the proportion of the US population that is white and Christian has declined by nearly 1/3. As recently as 1996, almost 2/3 of the US population identified as white and Christian. By 2006, that had declined to 54%, and by 2017, it was down to 43%. This finding prompted Robert Jones, CEO of Public Religion Research Institute, to declare the end of white Christian America. Thus, predominantly white denominations must confront their anxieties over declining membership rolls, congregational vitality, missional clarity, societal presence, and institutional clout. So I offer a missional perspective on congregational calling and ministry. That is, I understand bivocational ministry as a creative adaptation to the changing demographics and cultural landscape in North America. So we must expand our imaginations. Bivocational ministry can seem counter to the received wisdom of what counts as church and ministry in the fading Christendom in North America. Bishop Mark Eddington, an Episcopal bishop, puts it this way: the question many congregations face today is whether this professional model of ministry is consistent with their future or with them having a future. So I invite us to shift our perspective on bivocational ministry from a hiring arrangement to match shrinking budgets to a vision for mutually shared ministry and mission. So I offer this revised definition. Bivocational is an intentional missional strategy in which all members of a congregation, including the pastor, participate in ministry, exercising their unique vocations within and beyond the church in various occupations and employments. Intentional bivocational ministry as the congregation's calling requires changing individual congregational and judicatory perceptions, educating the congregation, equipping the laity, renegotiating pastoral duties and the role of laity, shared responsibilities between laity and clergy, resetting expectations for time commitments of pastor and church staff, and supporting healthy boundaries for those in ministry. Bivocational ministry is one creative adaptation to cultural change within a fading Christendom. Bivocational ministry is not just for pastors. It must also become the congregation's calling and mission. And I conclude by offering a few resources. Mark Eddington's book, Bivocational, Returning to the Roots of Ministry, is available free online. Jeffrey McDonald's book, Part-Time is Plenty, was published by Westminster John Knox Press in 2020. And my book, Bivocational and Beyond, is also available online or can be purchased in print copy.
Think about the practical practitioner work. We ask ourselves, what does a bivocational pastor need? How can we help? So think about the challenges that these pastors face in time and resources and training. And as an organization, ours, that it's itself limited in resources and personnel, what can we do? So we know that we can't help the pastor with hospital visitations. We can't go clean the church or run the sound or media on Sunday morning. And often we think of of these great helps, like how can we help that pastor get a theology degree, or a big assist. But many times these pastors, some of the things that dwell on their hearts and that they have to carry are sometimes smaller challenges and fires that they're facing in the administrative area or other areas of leadership. They get a property tax bill for $7,000 and they think, okay, what can we do? And perhaps in other organizations where there is a more hierarchical structure, our Baptist churches here in Texas, all the churches are independent, so they don't know where to turn to. And even though there are conventions that are there, they're set up for the bigger issues, right? So these day-to-day questions, what do I do now if my church hasn't paid taxes for 40 years, but now I'm getting this tax bill, and really all they need to do is fill out an exemption because the state changed some requirements. But who's going to help them with that? Come alongside and show them which forms they're going to fill. You have a new pastor who arrives at a church. They don't know what the legal status is of the church. We go in and research the Secretary of State's office to help for documentation, or those dreaded calls, like we have a problem and we really need to get the treasurer off of the signature page at the bank. And we provide resolutions for them. And those are kind of firefighting that needs to be done. It isn't fun, but it's necessary, and we have to make ourselves available sometimes to help these bivocational pastors with some of their most basic administrative and ministry helps. They may be second thoughts to pastors who are full-time or who have large ministries, or associate pastors and administrative pastors and bookkeepers and financial secretaries. But I want to tell you, there's this great feeling when you hear that sigh of relief from that bivocational pastor who is finally able to get someone to answer their call, to point them in the right direction, to help them with the resource. And so more important than those exceptional needs and the firefighting help, I think are the week-to-week needs that a bivocational pastor has. And if we're going to serve and resource these pastors, I think one of the areas that is most critical that we need to take into account is their time. So early on, when I was working with pastors, I would get frustrated and I think, why are they always calling me during lunch? Why are they calling me at 9 o'clock at night? And then I realized, well, that's when they're available. They're not sitting in an office like me. They may not be able to get on their phones at any time of the day. So when they're on their lunch break, or they've finally gotten home, that's when they're going to call, and that's when they need their help. So we need to be available when they're available, when the bivocational pastors are. And so maybe a valuable resource that your organization can provide for bivocational pastors is just to examine what are the resources that you're already providing that may need to be tweaked to be made more accessible to the bivocational pastor. We have an initiative called the Conexión Pastor Peer Group Initiative, and it's to help pastors develop healthy peer groups. And, all the research shows how congregations are blessed when their pastor is part of a healthy peer group. The problem is that in order to be a part of a peer group, you're tapping into one of the most challenged assets that a bivocational pastor has, which is his time. Apart from his family life and his employment and his ministry, you're asking them to give another hour, on a Saturday morning or to get together. And so we had planned these retreats to bring the pastors in to challenge them and encourage them to develop peer groups. We have funding for it, all of that. And when we talked to the bivocational pastors about how we could increase the attendance, they said, well, it would be really helpful if you invited our spouses, if we could bring our wives. And so we looked at our funding, and we had planned for 2 nights, and we went back and we changed the format. We invited the bivocational pastors to bring their spouses, and it's going to be 1 night instead of 2. As soon as we implemented that change, we had twice as many pastors participating in the next retreat and joining these peer groups. because of the incorporation of the spouse. So all of a sudden, it wasn't just another time away. It was something that they could take together. So that small tweak helped us take that program to more bivocational pastors. Another initiative that we have under the Thriving in Ministries initiative is called Iglesias Abundantes. And so many of our pastors are lay pastors, again, no seminary training. Then they don't have the time to be able to research issues like church life cycles and church systems, administrative systems, revitalization. And so that program comes alongside these pastors and says, we want to help you and your church leaders, because as Daryl mentioned, it's bivocational pastoral ministry involves the entire congregation. And so we said, Pastor, if you want to be a part of this revitalization initiative, bring 3 of your key leaders. And we incorporate those key leaders into this congregational learning process. And you know, many of them have never heard of a church health survey or an assessment or a community needs assessment and discovery. So begin to involve more than just the bivocational pastors. Find those key leaders that can help take some of the load off of the pastor. And then in our context, we talked about that emerging congregation within the congregation. So we'll often have a pastor who says, well, now I've got youth and they prefer to do everything in English. I need to find a youth leader or a youth director or a youth minister. And so we're going to assign this person. And they assign somebody, but they have no training. And most of our congregations are small. They can barely send their pastor to a training, much less a youth minister to Houston or to Dallas or some other place. So we've developed an arrangement with Right Now Media to provide free accounts to those next gen youth ministers, young adult leaders, children's ministers, English-speaking ministers in our Spanish congregations to be able to receive some training and resources online. So is the online training the perfect way to train leaders? No. But is it better than doing nothing and losing an entire generation in their congregation? It's a small step to helping them minister to that emerging congregation that's there. You know, I remember seeing a Twitter battle between 2 very famous pastors, and they were arguing over whether on a Sunday morning you should say the Bible says or Jesus says or Paul says. And I thought, wow, what an amazing privilege it must be to be able to sit around and just think about having a Twitter battle with another pastor over that kind of an issue. And our pastors, again, that time limit, how can we package resources for them that makes it more easily accessible for them? So for example, during COVID, many of our pastors, Spanish language pastors, all the resources that were coming out were in English. The state was saying, this is how you can reopen your church, but you got to follow these protocols, and all the protocols are in English. So instead of the pastors having to search all over the place, we set up one page in Spanish and in English. Here's all the COVID protocols for the state. Here's where you can find, you know, hand sanitizer. Here's some inexpensive streaming options. Here's the least expensive online giving. Here's somebody that in our organization, you can call them. They'll help you set up your streaming. They'll help you set up the online giving. And so when we think about resourcing them, sometimes some of the most basic resources that we can provide, if we can make it easy and accessible, and preferably accessible through their phone, we can help out a bivocational pastor.